Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun Live, where we have our special guest, Gordon Llewellyn-MacRae, Assistant Director at Shelter Scotland, who's going to talk to us about the Scottish Government's new housing or merged housing Cabinet Secretary brief with social justice, and also just about the national housing emergency that Scotland has been facing for quite some time now. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So what I'm going to kind of introduce the listeners to is that Scotland is in the midst of a housing emergency, but we're now seeing this housing brief from the Scottish Government merged with the social justice brief. It's something that Shelter Scotland has spoken about, voicing disappointment, anger at these two briefs being merged together. For listeners who might not follow the policy side closely, how significant is that change?
So we felt quite deflated by John Swinney's decision to sort of take the housing brief back into a shared portfolio. It feels that it's only less than a year, really, or a little over a year, since we've had a Cabinet Secretary for Housing. And our observation was, possibly always want them to go further and faster. It had been a catalyst for change. We had seen, just before that, we had seen a £200 million cut to the Affordable Housing Supply Programme reversed. We saw a Housing Emergency Action Plan published and a bit more dynamism back into things like the Housing to 2040 Strategy Board, the kind of behind-the-scenes group that includes industry, the public sector and the third sector, but to really sort of try and address the systemic issues in Scottish housing, because this is a massive problem. It underpins so many aspects of our approach to tackling poverty, health inequality, educational attainment, and yet it's the kind of Cinderella of Scottish politics. It keeps kind of coming in and coming out. It's a bit, we described it as the Cabinet Secretary hokey cokey, in 1 minute and back out again the other. And it does matter. Having a seat at the Cabinet table matters, because to fix a problem like housing and homelessness, you really need the ability to drive things through government, to figuratively knock heads together. And our recent experience of when this brief was jointly held before, when there was also a junior minister, was that things kind of stalled, things went backwards. So to have the taste of a dedicated Cabinet Secretary for Housing, who I would argue had been a catalyst for change, and now to go backward, it feels like we're going backwards. And for those of us who've been campaigning on this matter for some time, it just wasn't the energising and confidence building moment that we'd hoped the new Cabinet Secretary would be.
Some people might argue that housing and social justice are quite naturally linked issues. Might be helpful for both of them to share a Cabinet Secretary role. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say housing's linked to almost every part of the Scottish Government's brief. I think the question is capacity and capability. I've no doubt about the capability of Shirley-Anne Somerville. She's actually a former Shelter trustee. She's worked in the housing sector. She's done the brief before. She's experienced the balancing those competing priorities between the kind of growing responsibility around the social security agenda, but also developing the housing system. But she was supported by the junior minister previously. That's not there this time. And our concern is that when we're looking at establishing a new housing delivery agency, when we're looking at how do local authorities respond to record levels of homelessness, how do we start to rebuild those public services at a local level? And as we look actually towards the local government elections next year, we can see councils that are having to take money out of libraries, swimming pools, schools to pay for hotels for homeless households. We know this issue is going to be big, and our bigger worry is that will the new Cabinet Secretary have the time to provide the leadership to push back on those racist voices who want to weaponise the homelessness emergency to draw division in communities. This is a big agenda, and it's not too much for Shirley Ann Somerville as a person, but it may be too much for half a role to deal with the scale of the problem.
Sure, and you mentioned that sort of historic issue before. You've been here before. Can you just take us back to that time? When was that when you saw something like this happen before, with housing and social justice merged? So
Shirley Ann Somerville was previously, I don't want to get the title wrong, I think it was making social security rather than social justice and housing, and I think there was local government was in there at one point as well. And that was at the time when they were establishing the Social Security Agency. And as I say, Shirley Ann Somerville as an individual is one who knows the housing sector very well and has a lot of confidence and trust built up over many, many years. But the challenge for isn't about the capabilities of the individual, it's about the capacity of a system. And we've seen that when there was greater capacity and greater power and greater focus with the dedicated cabinet secretary, then we saw things happen. We saw things move. And that's the momentum we wanted to continue. And this feels like a backward step. But of course, we will work with the cabinet secretary. I'm sure other partners, whether it's the private, the public, or the third sector, will do similar. The challenge is, what are you going to do? And the other alarm bell for us is the key priority of the Scottish Government in the first 100 days seems to be money for first-time buyers, not the structural problems in the housing system. So we've got the kind of backward step on leadership, and then a bit of another backward step in terms of focus.
Because we're also coming at this from a point of view where, we had Mary McCallan. She was seen as a bit of a rising star, and she was given this cabinet secretary for housing role by John Swinney. It was seen as a major role for her. Now they've kind of taken that away, and we've got this position for Shirley Ann Somerville, where we are seeing the merge of social justice and housing put together. How did you find, though, when Mary McCallan was in the role, what were your kind of thoughts on her performance?
We found her very open. The first time we really had a chance to speak with her directly was when we hosted the joint fringe meeting at the SNP conference in Aberdeen with the Chartered Institute of Housing and also the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. And that was us talking to research that showed that we needed about 15,693 homes, affordable homes, every year, not to eradicate homelessness, but just simply to stop homelessness growing at a faster rate, to start to turn that dial. And what we found was she was very interested in things like the impact on children in temporary accommodation, the kind of lifetime impact on their lives. And she had the bandwidth, frankly, to kind of engage in the breadth of the challenges that we face. We also saw that there were changes behind the scenes in the civil service, new teams were brought together. We had the housing emergency team put together that were talking to the Housing 2040 board. So, like any of these things, it's not just about the cabinet secretary themselves, but what they represent within the system of government. And at Shelter Scotland, our real worry is that, whilst there are some overlaps between social justice brief and housing, it would be easy for people to start to think that homelessness occurs because of people's individual failings. And yet we know that homelessness is the consequence of having too few homes. This is long established. There is not a route out of homelessness that doesn't look like building more homes. And what we had seen in the dedicated post was the ability to bring in the economic brief, planning, bring in other parts of government into that conversation. And whilst I'm sure that there are still ways for Shirley Ann Somerville to do something similar, when it's pigeonholed as a social policy brief rather than a structural, economic and societal brief, there's a risk that some of the people we need to get around the table simply don't play ball.
Do you foresee things getting worse or better this year due to that change, Gordon?
I think we expect homelessness to get worse again this year. We'd be delighted to be proved wrong, but I think the fundamentals would show that we're not seeing the level of affordable house building pick up pace that we would need to see. We're going to go through a year of transition with I think some interesting ideas and some welcome ideas around the More Homes Agency, but we still don't know who's going to run it, when it's going to get going, what powers it's going to have. But we know that any transition in policy circles takes time and takes time to bed in. But we're really worried about local authorities. We have two local authorities, Edinburgh and Glasgow, that the housing regulator says are in systemic failure for their homelessness services. That means they simply do not have the capacity to meet demand. That is a national scandal that I think doesn't get the attention that it deserves. We have another 9 local authorities who are, the regulator describes as being at heightened risk of systemic failure. So more than 50% of the population live in a local authority where if they required support from a homelessness service, they could not be guaranteed their legal entitlement to support. And this is where we can go back to, is housing a Cinderella portfolio in government, or is it right at the heart of the future of the Scotland we want to build? So our concerns aren't about any individual per se, it's about the structure, the focus and the capability of government from the minister right down through to frontline civil servants.
And you've mentioned that frustration with, you've seen policies or pledges around maybe helping people with first-time buying, and that maybe not being translated into tackling that systemic issues. What kind of things what kind of support do you really need to see as a charity for Shelter Scotland to help people who are facing this housing crisis?
The simple answer is we need to build more social homes where they're needed. Not all homes. There's no point building large, expensive private homes in places where there's no great demand or there's no great impact. We need social homes, affordable homes in the places of highest demand. That is largely our cities. It's not exclusively our cities, but it's largely our cities in the Central Belt. We worry that we see this continued focus on people being the problem, not building homes. And it's easy to then fall into the trap of trying to do flashy policy initiatives that do nothing really other than draw attention away from the fundamentals. It is hard, it is expensive, but it is not beyond our means to build more homes at scale and at pace. But what we find is we have legislation that simply is a mitigation for the lack of homes. So rent controls in the private rented sector, it's not a solution to the housing emergency, but it might make it slightly, the best case scenario for the rent controls are that rents go up slightly more slowly than they would otherwise. We've seen things like the prevention duty coming in to sort of change the way in which local authorities are required to respond to homelessness. On paper, that sounds a great idea, but we'll go back to we have at this point in time 11 local authorities who are deemed to be at heightened risk of systemic failure. They don't have the capacity for what they need to do now, and yet we're placing more burdens on them to do even more. So what we want to see is let's get away from more laws, let's get away from new flashy initiatives, and let's get back to the fundamentals, the foundations of our housing system. Building more social homes brings down private rents. It increases the opportunities for first-time buyers because you eliminate the tier of private landlords competing with first-time buyers for the lower end of the owner-occupation market. It gives households stable, secure homes where they need, so it means that we can address some of the social inequalities in our community. But right now, we don't even have plans to build the homes needed just to tackle the backlog in homelessness. So what we say is, we don't have a programme for government yet for this government, but we do know we've got a programme for homelessness. The continued Scottish Government policies, and to be honest, no other party offered anything different at the election. But the policies that are being proposed just now will not reduce homelessness, and in some respects, for things like first-time buyer pots of money, may actually drive up prices and make the situation worse in the long term.
And so the only real solution, real impactful, meaningful solution is this building more social homes.
Building more social homes, paying for building more social homes, and then delivering those social homes. Those are big, hard things to do that require political capital and political leadership, which is why having a dedicated housing minister to drive that agenda through was so much in demand from the sector.
Do you think there is incentive and appetite to build more social homes around this new cabinet table? I know obviously we've spoken about the brief merging. You've described it as deprioritisation and a downgrade. But do you think there is willingness and an appetite to build those social homes with other kind of cabinet secretaries, with other people surrounding John Swinney?
I think in principle, yes. I think the Scottish Government, and actually I think there's a broad consensus within the Scottish Parliament that building more homes is the answer, that building more social homes, there's a role for government in meeting the housing needs of the nation. That's not controversial in Scotland, and that's welcomed on pretty much all sides of the Parliament. And that's different from other parts of the UK, where there is still a debate about the role of government. The challenge is to actually do it. On paper, the Scottish Government talk about more homes, they talk about ending homelessness, they talk about driving racism out of the system, they talk about helping children out of unsafe temporary accommodation. But it's not happening quickly enough. It's not happening because there aren't literal shovels in the ground in the places there needs to be. And doing the hard stuff takes time. So as a campaigning charity, what we're trying to say is, let's stop pushing for more and more and more things that will never happen. We don't need 20-year ambitions to achieve something. We don't need new laws that create targets that will never be delivered. Let's just do the fundamentals. Let's put the money into the front line. Let's make the choice to invest in the long term, and then we'll start to see homelessness fall and opportunity grow.
And just finally, Gordon, you've spoken about potentially seeing racism come into the conversation as well around housing, particularly in Scotland. What do you see as a charity? What does Shelter Scotland as a charity see when it comes to racism? Is it people who are applying for social housing? Where is this racism coming from, do you think?
The racism that we see actually is on things like our own social media accounts. We see any mention of homelessness now becoming associated with lies around illegal migrants. Illegal migrants have no right to social housing because they're illegal migrants. We see lies around the scale of the amount of homes that go to foreign nationals and all these other things. And it is lies. We need to be very clear that the proportion of refugees coming to Scotland has grown in recent years, but we see the backlog in the refugee system starting to more than half in some places. And we have a long-term kind of drive to increase the population of Scotland that the housing system has got to adapt to. But what we really worry about is that it's another one of these excuses for some politicians to get them off the hook for building the homes that we need. We don't need to build more homes if we just stop those people that aren't like us coming here to get them. We don't need those more homes if people would just behave a little bit better and be responsible. And that's why at Shelter Scotland, we see our job is to really draw out the evidence. And the evidence is clear. Homelessness is caused by the lack of housing. That's why homelessness is highest in our cities, where there are more people competing for jobs, competing for space, competing for homes. So we need to have an honest conversation. It's not about broken people. It's about a broken system that our politicians choose to pay lip service to rather than rebuild it from the ground up.
Gordon Llewellyn-MacRae, thank you very much for joining us on Unspun Live.